it's definitely desperately tight, a tiny number of points ahead of Ferrari and barely more ahead of Red Bull. All three of us will be wanting that P2 slot in the championship.
Hi everyone, I'm Olivia, and this week I'm joined by James answering all your questions from the eventful Azerbaijan Grand Prix on this week's ACOTUS Debrief. James, pretty good weekend, I'd say so.
Well, it was very welcome to be back on the podium, and even more welcome to have both cars scoring good points. And I guess cherry on the top of all that was that it was on a weekend where our closest rivals stumbled a little. So yeah, it was a good weekend for us.
First, on to George's race. He had a pretty difficult start to the race with his illness, but still managed an incredible P2. So how did he manage all of that, and how close did he get to not actually starting the race?
I mean, I think by yours and my standards, he was pretty poorly. You definitely wouldn't imagine that someone as crook as he was would clamber into a car and go racing it. Our reserve driver is Valtteri, and briefing Valtteri about this possibility, and Valtteri in his phlegmatic way just went, he'll be okay. And I think that's not so much that George was well, it's that the standard that the drivers set for themselves is that they will clamber into a car if they can force themselves to do so. And that's what George did, and managed to hold himself together all weekend despite feeling really very, very crook.
Now, how did we manage that incredible pit stop that allowed him to keep that P2 position?
That was an exciting time in that race. We were watching lap after lap with George right on the bubble of being able to make that overcut work. We actually thought that he was a little bit behind and that he was going to come out right on the tail of Sainz and have to get by on the track. So it was a fantastic thing to see him emerge in front and by a second or so. And it was one of those pit stops where everything came together. It wasn't just that the guys on the guns and the wheel handling, that all that went as per choreographed and really slick. That did happen, but it was more than that. If you'd watched George's in-lap, he absolutely smoked the in-lap and really took a lot of time away, much more than we expected in the way he got round the second half of that in-lap. And it was just brilliant seeing it when it all comes together like that and the overcut happens. It's a great feeling.
With his tires, why did we decide to put George onto the hard tires, considering the fact that we hadn't actually tested them in the free practice sessions?
Well, we hadn't tested the mediums either, and it's a strange thing at Baku with this C6 tyre, the softest soft compound that Pirelli make. It's really not a particularly great compound, and so all the teams were trying to avoid having it figure large in the weekend, and that meant not having a lot of experience on either medium or hard. So we elected to just split our strategies, to give one to one driver, one to the other, medium for Kimi, hard to George, because that just sort of balanced our risks. And if you're going to split medium and hard like that, then you would tend to give the driver further back on the grid the hard and further forward the medium. And that's what we did, and it worked out nicely for us.
Why do you do that? Sorry, just to explain a little bit further, why you would put the driver that's a bit further back onto the hards.
If you've got a car that you believe has natural pace, and we did believe that we would have okay race pace, and that car's further back down the grid, then at a certain point people in front of them will clear out the way with pit stops, and if the pace of the car is there, then you can let that hard tyre run fairly deep into the race and really benefit from those free air laps when everyone tucks into the pits ahead of you. And that tends to be more a thing that works when you're a little bit further back. Conversely, if you're further up the grid with a bit more to lose from something like if there were an early safety car and you're sitting on a hard tyre, then you really don't you don't want to be forced off your hard tyre right at the beginning of the race, whereas it's less of a problem to be forced off of a medium tyre. So a bit further up the grid with a bit more to lose because your qualifying position was better, you're more interested in things like, am I going to get a good start with the softer, grippier tyre? So it just shifts the judgment slightly. Now, George and Kimi were very close to one another on the grid, so this was not so much, well, he was back there and so it was one thing and he was up at the front and it was another. They were right near to one another, and it was more just, if we have one on each, then the race could go in lots of different ways with safety cars, and we are covering more options by being in that way.
And on to Kimi, he looked a lot more consistent this weekend. Is there anything that's changed in his approach compared to more recent races?
I think the approach from all of us really just to make consistent sessions the order of the day, understanding with Kimi, and that focus and attention on those free practice sessions is crucial for arriving in qualifying in good shape, which is crucial for making the race work out for you, and that any slip-ups in free practice are much more costly than they appear, so the concentration on that needs to be collectively high from all of us, and Kimi certainly played a champion part in making sure that he really didn't put a foot wrong. I think he went up an escape road once during the weekend, but absolutely not a scratch on his car into qualifying, which was pretty difficult. You saw how many red flags there were in qualifying. Kimi came through that in good nick, did a good lap. He was within one gusty corner away from being P2 on the grid, and had a good weekend as a consequence.
Now on to the car itself. Was there any significant improvements that we brought that allowed us to find so much pace in Baku?
Not really, no. The layout of the car, the upgrade program really is tapered right down now, with much of the focus on 2026 and getting ready for that big shift in the rules for next year. And that's true up and down the grid. So when you see shifts in form like this, it's really a function of two things. One, a team having a good weekend, and in this case us having a good weekend, is because we did all our preparation absolutely spot on. We had an untroubled time in free practice, and everything was just running smoothly for us throughout the weekend. And so what goodness is in the car, we were able to bring it all to the fore. So that's the first thing, if you can have an untroubled, smooth transit through the weekend. The second is that just car characteristics vary up and down the pit lane. The Red Bull seems to like low downforce tracks and was flying. They've been relatively kind to us as well. You remember Montreal, we were pretty decent there, and we're okay here in Baku. And so there were things about the track that suited the characteristic of our car, which may not be true when we go to Singapore next week or in the next race. So yeah, it was a good weekend. Good to make sure we got the points when we had a car that could do it, but obviously that's the thing we have to do weekend after weekend.
Obviously there was no upgrades for this weekend, but our rear wheel shields looked a little bit different. Can you tell me anything about that?
It was a rear wheel shield made of renewable carbon rather than the stuff that we would normally make it out of, and so a bio-friendly material. That is a good thing, that we have managed to put a small component of the car out of ecologically friendly material, but it's only a small component. I think this is the tip of an iceberg that will get bigger over future seasons, and I don't just mean in our team. I think this will be something that the industry will move towards. It's certainly a thing that the regulator is in discussion with the teams about how to encourage that to happen, and all the teams will be looking at the way in which these materials come online and the appropriate ways in which they can be used on the car, and that will be a sort of gradual transition.
Back onto the race then, was there ever any consideration of swapping out the cars before Kimi's pit stop when George had the better tires and looked to be the quicker driver?
Not really. No, we're not shy about those swaps. They can be done in a way that doesn't disadvantage either driver when the drivers are clearly on different strategies. If you just allow the cars to quickly go by one another when one's on new tyres and the other on older tyres, that can happen without any harm to either cars. But in this particular instance, it really didn't need to. We knew that Kimi ahead on the medium tyre was coming to the end of his stint, and with tyres that, because they're medium and not hard, were just degrading slightly, so his pace was starting to tail away. George behind was really picking up his pace and was coming up behind Kimi, but we could see that they would eventually intercept, but we knew that by the time they did, Kimi would have gone in the pits naturally as part of his strategy. So there was no need in that particular instance to consider swapping, because the sort of natural flow of the pit stops was going to clear the road ahead of George in any case.
And on to the Constructors' Championships. I mean, the Red Bulls, the Ferraris, quite close in the battle with us. And how are we then managing risk versus consistency with these final 7 races of the season?
Well, it's definitely desperately tight. A tiny number of points ahead of Ferrari and barely more ahead of Red Bull. All 3 of us will be wanting that P2 slot in the championship. Red Bull have really been on a roll recently, with Max showing extraordinary form in that car, and Ferrari too are strong competitors. our focus will be on making sure that we get both our cars up there strongly in the points at every weekend, and that is largely, we're masters of our own destiny there, because that is how well we prepare for the weekends, how well we then execute that plan and give the drivers a stable platform that they've had plenty of laps in on the Friday, so that when it comes to getting the job done on the Saturday and Sunday, they feel confident to do so. While we are expecting this to be horribly tight all the way to the end of the season, it's absolutely there for us if we work well.
And finally, we did touch on Singapore slightly. The colder weather in Baku helped us out this weekend. I think Singapore is a little bit hotter, isn't it? So how do you expect the W16 to perform?
You're right to point out the temperature difference, but it really isn't sort of just as one-dimensional as cold equals good, hot equals bad. We've been strong in hot races. We've had some difficult times in cold races. The more interesting difference between Baku and Singapore is Baku has lots of corners where you get the braking done more or less in a straight line, and by the time you pitch into the corner, because the corner is quite slow and it's sharp and 90 degrees-ish, you're not so much braking and turning in together, you're sort of braking first then turning in. Singapore has more of the type of corner where you are highish speed, braking and turning in together, and that has been the thing that has been relatively harder for us, because our car is less stable than we would wish it to be in that combined braking and turning situation. So if you take that, add it to the fact that it's a warmer sort of place, those will be the things that we've been needing to guard against, trying to get that stability into the car in that opening phase of the corner, so that the drivers feel confident to pitch it in on a tight, intimidating circuit where the walls will clobber you in the blink of an eye. That will be where a good weekend comes from, if we can do that.